Tonight, beneath the pale shimmer of a winter moon, we turn our gaze toward a forgotten corner of the northern world, where snow never melts, and the stars seem close enough to touch. The wind there sings softly through the pines, carrying stories older than memory itself. Among them, one tale endures, whispered by shepherds, told by wanderers beside dying fires. The legend of the frost child, born beneath the longest night. They say she came into the world when even the aurora grew still, and silence held the earth in its frozen cradle. Some claimed she was a blessing to a village on the edge of despair. Others feared she was something the snow itself had dreamed into being, a soul woven from moonlight and storm. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome everyone joining us tonight, whether you're listening from the gentle hush of an American evening, the deep stillness of a European midnight, or the quiet beginnings of morning somewhere far across the world. Wherever you are, take a moment to settle in, dim the lights. Let the sound of this story carry you. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where and when you're listening from. It's always wonderful to see this small, peaceful community stretch across time zones and continents. Now, take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day slip away. The firelight flickers low, and the snow begins to fall again. Our story begins, far to the north, on the eve of the solstice, the longest night of the year. The village lay wrapped in snow, so deep it seemed the earth itself had been forgotten beneath it. Roofs bowed under white drifts, and the paths between homes were little more than tunnels carved by weary hands. Smoke rose in thin, wavering trails from stone chimneys, only to vanish into a sky the color of old slate. No one remembered when the sun had last been seen, only the long twilight that bled from one day into the next, painting the world in shades of blue and silver. The villagers spoke little now. Their stores of grain were nearly gone, and the few sheep that remained huddled close in the frostbitten pens. Yet even in such quiet despair, life persisted. The baker still rose before dawn to tend her small fire. The blacksmith still coaxed his forge to life, its glow a fragile defiance against the dark. And on this night, this longest of all, something stirred beyond the frozen river. A strange stillness fell, deeper than before. The dogs pricked their ears but did not bark. The air itself seemed to listen. From the heart of the forest came a shimmer, faint as breath, cold as glass. The aurora gathered its light and folded it down, spilling green and violet upon the snow. Then, as the villagers peered through frosted windows, they saw her, a small figure lying in the snowdrift beside the old pine, wrapped in a pale shimmer like mist. No one spoke. The wind had stopped, and when they finally dared to move toward her, they saw that the child's hair was white as frost, her skin faintly glowing in the moonlight, and her breath rose in soft, crystalline clouds. The midwife knelt first, brushing snow from the child's cheek. "She's alive," she whispered, voice trembling, born from the cold itself. And so began the story of the frost child, the one who arrived when hope was nearly gone. They carried the child through the silent streets, each footstep muffled by snow. The old midwife, wrapped in a shawl of wool and smoke, held the bundle close against her chest. The other villagers followed at a cautious distance, not out of malice, but of awe, for none had ever seen such a thing. A child who did not cry, whose presence seemed to hush the night itself. Inside the midwife's cottage, the hearth burned low, its light trembling against the walls of rough-hewn timber. She set the child beside the fire, careful not to startle her. Yet the flames did something strange. They bent toward the infant, as if drawn by her quiet pulse. Sparks shimmered and danced like stars caught in a slow, hypnotic orbit. The villagers watched in stillness. Someone muttered a prayer. Another crossed himself, whispering that no good came from children found in snow. But the midwife only frowned softly. Her eyes filled with an old, weary wisdom. "She's not a curse," she murmured. "She's a reminder." The frost child opened her eyes, then eyes of pale blue, so light they seemed almost translucent. They reflected the fire, the snow, and something else, a calm older than time. She reached out a tiny hand toward the flames, and for a moment the crackling wood fell silent. The warmth did not burn her. It bowed, like the rest of the world, in quiet respect. Outside, the pines whispered. Their branches, heavy with frost, swayed as though stirred by a wind no one could feel. The villagers turned toward the window, uneasy, yet unable to look away. The night was speaking, in a language none remembered, but all could feel, a language of breath and shadow, of ice and ember. And then, just as suddenly, the whisper faded. The midwife covered the child with a woolen blanket and looked up at the faces around her. "She needed a name," she said. The villagers hesitated. Naming her meant claiming her, and claiming her meant accepting whatever fate she carried. At last, the baker's wife, whose eyes were kind even in hunger, spoke softly. "If she was born on the solstice," she said, "then she belongs to the frost and the dawn that follows it." The midwife nodded. "Then we shall call her Ira," she said, voice almost reverent, "for the snow that falls softly but never forgets." And outside, as if in answer, the wind began to move again, low and gentle, sweeping through the trees with a sound like distant singing. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself were reluctant to wake the world. A pale light crept across the snow, turning every drift into a faint shimmer of silver. The villagers, still dazed from the night before, gathered in quiet knots outside their homes. No one spoke of what they had seen, but all felt it a strange calm, as if the long night had finally exhaled. In the midwife's cottage, the fire still burned. The frost child, Ira, slept soundly in a basket lined with sheepskin. Frost crystals formed along the rim, yet the air around her remained soft and mild. When the midwife leaned close, she swore she could hear faint music, not from the room, but from within the child herself, a hum like wind moving through hollow ice. She touched the infant's brow, expecting the chill of snow, but found warmth there instead, gentle, steady, like the first blush of dawn. As the day unfolded, the villagers brought small offerings to the midwife's door, a crust of bread, a scrap of wool, a prayer whispered in passing. No one said it aloud, but each gift was an act of quiet apology for their fear, their doubt, and the unspoken awe that had taken root in their hearts. By midday, the sky began to change. Clouds rolled in from the east, heavy with snow, yet the air grew strangely still. The midwife stepped outside to fetch water from the well, and as she looked toward the forest, she saw the pines standing utterly motionless, their branches heavy but unmoving, their shadows sharp and clear. And then she saw something else, faint footprints leading away from her door, tiny perfect prints, like those of a child, pressed into the snow and glowing faintly blue in the dim light. Her breath caught. She turned toward the cottage, but Ira was still inside, asleep. The midwife followed the tracks only a few steps before they vanished at the edge of the wood, swallowed by the frost. When she returned, the baby stirred and opened her eyes. The midwife spoke softly. "You'll bring change, won't you, little one?" Ira only blinked, her gaze serene. Outside, a single ray of sunlight broke through the cloud cover, gilding the snow in pale gold. the first true light the village had seen in many months. The midwife sank into her chair by the fire, the faintest smile touching her lips. Somewhere deep in the forest, she could swear the pines were whispering again, not in warning this time, but in welcome. By the time another week had passed, word of the frost child had drifted through the valley like mist. Farmers from the southern fields, trappers from the forests, and even traders from the river road came to the little village, wrapped in wonder. They brought their wares, candles of beeswax, woven mittens, jars of honey sealed against the cold, and gathered in the square, where frost bloomed in delicate veins along every surface. The winter market was small that year, subdued by hardship, but it felt different now. The cold still bit, yet it seemed gentler, as if the world itself had softened. Beneath the muffled sky, the sound of quiet laughter returned, the first in many months. The midwife walked among them with Ira nestled close in her shawl. The child had grown quickly, her eyes wide and unafraid, reflecting every flicker of light, as though she could see beauty where others saw only snow. The villagers watched her in silent reverence. Some offered her trinkets or bits of food, though she never reached for them. "She doesn't eat much," the midwife said softly when asked. "She takes only milk, and even that not often. I think she drinks the light instead." The baker's wife smiled, though her eyes glistened with quiet awe. "Then may she never go hungry." As the day went on, the snow began to fall again, slow, steady, and fine as powdered glass. The traders packed their goods beneath cloth canopies, and the children chased one another through the drifts, their laughter carrying like bells. Above it all, the pines whispered faintly in the distance, a low rhythmic murmur that no wind stirred. Near the market's end, an old shepherd approached the midwife. His beard was white with frost, his voice cracked by years of cold. "You should take care, old friend," he said. "A child found in the snow carries the mark of things unseen, blessing or curse. It seldom walks alone." The midwife met his gaze without fear. "I have no doubt she was meant to come," she replied, "and if there is a shadow to her light, we will face it when it comes." That evening, when the market fires dimmed and the stars came out, Ira stirred and reached toward the sky. Her small fingers spread as though tracing the constellations, and above her, the northern lights shimmered to life, a great ribbon of green and violet winding across the heavens. The villagers fell silent, their breath catching in the cold air. The aurora had not been seen since the famine began, and in that silence, beneath the dancing lights, hope flickered again, fragile, flickering, but real. The thaw never came that winter. The river that ran along the village's edge lay bound in white glass, its surface unbroken, its depths sealed in silence. Yet one night, when the moon rose round in silver over the frozen fields, the midwife awoke to a sound faint, low and strange. It was music, not the music of flute or fiddle, but something deeper, a hum that seemed to rise from the ice itself. It threaded through the night like a pulse, soft as breath, steady as a heartbeat. The midwife rose from her bed, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside into the quiet. Ira was already awake, sitting near the hearth, her pale eyes reflecting the faint shimmer that seeped beneath the door. She looked toward the sound, her expression serene. The midwife hesitated, then took the child into her arms and followed the melody toward the river. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots. Around her, the village slept, windows dim, chimneys dark. Only the frost seemed to stir, alive with faint motes of light that drifted and faded like fireflies trapped in winter's breath. When she reached the river bank, the sound grew clearer. The ice glowed faintly blue, as though lit from beneath. The midwife knelt, holding Ira close. The light rippled, and for a moment she saw shapes beneath the frozen surface, faint, fluid, and fleeting. Figures, perhaps, or memories. The music grew stronger. It wasn't frightening, it was calm, almost tender, like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. Ira reached out a small hand and touched the ice. Where her fingers met it, frost bloomed outward in delicate spirals, each one shaped like a snowflake spinning in slow motion. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music faded. The glow sank back into darkness. The only sound left was the soft whisper of falling snow. The midwife looked down at Ira, who was still gazing at the ice. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "What did you hear, little one?" she murmured. "What song was that?" Ira did not answer, could not, but she pressed her small palm to the woman's cheek. It was cool, but comforting, like the air before dawn. When they returned home, the midwife placed her gently in the cradle and sat for a long while beside the fire. The embers crackled softly, and the whisper of the river still echoed faintly in her thoughts. Something was stirring beneath the world, something ancient and gentle, waiting to be remembered. 3 days after the night of the river's song, a figure appeared on the horizon, dark against the blinding white. The villagers saw him first from the watch-point above the mill, a lone traveler moving slowly through the drifts, his cloak rimmed with frost and his steps steady but heavy. Few strangers came this far north in winter, and fewer still came alone. When he reached the village, the air seemed to hold its breath. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes like storm clouds and a staff carved from pale birch. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but resonant, carrying the weight of long journeys and longer silences. "I seek shelter," he said simply, and word of the child born beneath the solstice moon. The villagers exchanged wary glances. The blacksmith folded his arms. "There's talk enough of her already," he said, "but talk isn't for strangers." The man nodded, as though expecting the suspicion. Then he drew from his pack a small object, a shard of ice, clear as glass, glowing faintly from within. The midwife, who had stepped out upon hearing the commotion, felt her breath still. That same soft light, the hue of frost under moonlight, shone in Ira's eyes. "Who are you?" she asked. The stranger inclined his head. "A listener," he said, "one who hears what others forget. The world shifts when a child like her is born, and the balance trembles." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Some drew back, uneasy, as though fearing his words might conjure the very cold they described. But the midwife only gestured toward her door. "If you bring no harm," she said, "you're welcome to warm yourself by my fire." Inside the cottage, the man sat near the hearth, while Ira slept in her cradle. His gaze lingered on her, not with greed or fear, but something gentler, like sorrow. "She carries the breath of winter," he murmured, "a soul made of snow and starlight. You've felt it, haven't you?" The world around her bending, softening. The midwife nodded slowly. "She brings light," she said, "even in the darkest hours. Light and silence." The stranger replied, "Both can heal, both can take." For a long time they sat without speaking. The only sound, the soft crackle of burning wood. Outside, the wind had fallen completely still, a sign the stranger noticed with quiet gravity. He set the glowing shard of ice beside the fire, where it did not melt, and whispered words too faint to catch. When he rose to leave, the midwife asked, "Will you return?" He paused at the door, his shadow long against the snow. "When the river sings again," he said, and when she begins to answer. Then he was gone, leaving only a faint trail of frost that glittered in the firelight. That night, Ira stirred in her sleep. Her breath came soft and rhythmic, and the frost upon the window pane formed shapes like wings, fragile, bright, and fleeting. The days that followed the stranger's visit were heavy with stillness. The sky hung low, grey and swollen with unfallen snow. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move, as though the world were waiting for something it could not name. The villagers went about their lives, speaking in hushed tones. They whispered of omens, of the man who had come and gone without leaving footprints, of the shard that glowed but did not melt, and of the frost child who slept through every storm. Ira grew quieter as the days stretched on. She no longer reached for the flames, nor watched the pines sway through the window. Instead, she would sit in the cradle and listen, head tilted slightly, as if hearing a sound too faint for others to catch. The midwife sometimes caught her murmuring in her sleep, words soft as falling snow, too gentle to understand. At dusk one evening, the midwife stepped outside to fetch more firewood. The air was sharp, the kind that turned breath into silver. Overhead, the clouds churned, vast and heavy, yet unmoving. The world looked suspended, like a moment stretched to thin. That was when she noticed the birds, dozens of them, ravens, crows, even the small sparrows that should have long fled south, all perched along the rooftops and trees, utterly silent. Their black shapes were still as carved obsidian. Then, as she turned back toward her door, the air shifted. A low hum began to rise from the direction of the river, faint at first, then growing stronger, the same melody she had heard before. The ice was singing again. She hurried inside, heart trembling. Ira was awake, her pale eyes wide and luminous. Frost was spreading in thin threads from her cradle across the wooden floor, not cold but soft, as if made of light instead of ice. The midwife knelt beside her, whispering gently, "It's all right, little one, you're safe." But Ira was not afraid. She looked past the woman, toward the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow and deliberate, each flake larger than a coin, shimmering faintly as it drifted, and with every flake that touched the ground, the hum deepened. The midwife pressed her hand to the window pane. The frost there pulsed beneath her fingers like a heartbeat. She realized then this was no ordinary storm. It was gathering around the child, called by her breath, her dreams, or something older that lived within her. And then came the first rumble, not thunder, but a deep groan, as though the earth itself were waking. Ira blinked once, calmly, and the light in her eyes brightened, soft, steady, unafraid. The storm had begun. That evening, the village became a world of silver. Snow fell in great, spiraling veils, wrapping homes and fences in ghostly white. The wind rose at last, not fierce, but vast, as though the heavens themselves had taken a long, shuddering breath. The midwife bolted her shutters and stoked the fire until the small room glowed like amber. Yet even the warmth seemed uncertain, bending before the hush that filled the air. She held Ira close, rocking her gently as flakes of frost drifted down the chimney and melted into sparks. Outside, the storm deepened. The pines groaned beneath their burden, and the river, still locked in its frozen armor, began to pulse with light, the same cold blue glow seen once before. The villagers gathered in the square, lanterns flickering like stars swallowed by fog. They spoke in murmurs, voices trembling with fear and wonder. "It's her," they whispered. "The frost child is calling the winter itself." And above them, the clouds split. Through the rift spilled the northern lights, not a gentle shimmer, but a torrent of color, vast and radiant, sweeping across the sky like the hem of a celestial veil. Green, violet, and silver ribbons streamed above, twisting and folding upon one another, until even the snow seemed to glow from within. In the midwife's cottage, Ira lifted her head and looked toward the ceiling. Her small hands reached upward, and the firelight dimmed as if yielding to something greater. The midwife watched in stillness, awe mingling with the faint ache of fear. She could feel the power gathering, not violent, but immense, ancient, and deliberate. Then came a sound that no one in the village would ever forget, the sharp, clean crack of ice breaking. The river split in two with a deep, echoing groan. Steam and mist rose into the air, curling like breath. Beneath the ice, water began to move again, dark and alive, rushing through the heart of winter's stillness. Ira's eyes glowed with pale light. The storm outside began to soften. The wind dropped, the snow fell slower, and the pines swayed like sleepers sighing in their dreams. The villagers stood in silence as the aurora's brilliance began to fade, leaving only a faint, lingering shimmer in the night. And when the last trace of color vanished, they saw that the sky had cleared, the stars sharp, countless, and bright. By dawn, the world lay peaceful once more. The river ran free beneath its thin crust of ice, the air clean and still. And in the quiet that followed, the midwife whispered to the child in her arms, "You've woken something, haven't you? Something the world forgot." Ira closed her eyes and drifted to sleep, her breath soft, her fingers curled as if holding a dream. When morning came, it arrived in silence, not the heavy hush of dread, but the kind of stillness that follows a long and tender sigh. The world outside was transformed. The snow, once harsh and grey, now glittered like crushed glass beneath the newborn sun. Roofs bowed beneath crystalline drifts, and icicles hung from eaves like fragile chandeliers. The villagers emerged slowly, blinking against the light. They had not seen the sun in many months, and its return felt almost unreal, warm, golden, and soft upon their faces. Children laughed for the first time that season, their voices echoing through the narrow streets. The old baker stepped from her doorway and wept openly, her tears freezing into tiny jewels upon her cheeks. At the heart of it all, the river flowed. Its frozen shell had fractured into delicate shards that caught the light like broken mirrors, and beneath them, the water murmured low and gentle, like a voice speaking from the deep. The villagers gathered at its banks in wonder. The frost along the edges glowed faintly blue, the same color they had seen in the stranger's shard and in Ira's eyes. The midwife carried Ira down to the river that morning. The child was wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, her white hair catching the sunlight until it looked almost translucent. When the villagers saw her, they fell quiet, not out of fear, but reverence. She looked smaller now, fragile and human, and yet something in her presence held them all still. The midwife knelt beside the water. The ice at the river's edge melted gently beneath her touch. "You did this," she whispered. "You brought the light back." Ira blinked, watching the current with calm curiosity. Her small hand reached toward it, fingers brushing the air just above the surface. Where she pointed, frost bloomed, but instead of sealing the water, it shaped itself into patterns, flowers, stars, and spiral paths that shimmered like living lace. The villagers gasped. Some knelt, others crossed themselves. A few simply stared, too moved for words. But the midwife only smiled faintly. "She's not a curse," she said again, her voice carrying on the breeze. "She's balance, winter's child, not its servant." The blacksmith stepped forward. His broad hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the glowing frost. "Then, perhaps," he murmured, "we've all been waiting for her to remind the world how to breathe again." The villagers nodded slowly, the fear that had once shadowed their hearts melting like ice beneath the sun. That night, when darkness returned, the stars shone brighter than they had in generations. The air was so clear that the Milky Way stretched across the heavens in a river of light, a reflection, it seemed, of the water that now ran free below. And as the midwife lay Ira to rest in her cradle, the faintest hum returned, softer now, like a lullaby sung by the thawing world. It was deep into that thawed stillness, a week, perhaps more, when the stranger returned. The villagers saw him first as a dark figure moving across the new snowmelt, his cloak heavy with frost, his staff gleaming faintly in the dawn light. The midwife, busy hanging herbs by her doorway, felt a shift in the air before she saw him, a ripple, like the world pausing to listen. He came without sound, his steps leaving no mark upon the softening earth. When he reached the village square, he found the people changed. The faces that had once greeted him with suspicion now carried a quiet calm. The children played near the riverbank, laughter mingling with the sound of running water. "You've brought her peace," the midwife said, stepping forward. "Or perhaps she brought it to us." The stranger bowed his head. "I warned you the balance trembles," he said softly. "Now you can feel its sway." She studied him, his eyes, the grey of gathering mist, his face, drawn but kind. "You speak as though she's a force, not a child." He met her gaze. "She is both. The frost child is no mere soul. She is the breath between seasons, the dream that winter leaves behind." When the storm opened the sky, the old bond woke again. The villagers gathered around, listening. "What bond?" the blacksmith asked. "The bond between warmth and cold," the stranger replied. "Between stillness and life. There was a time when those two halves danced together, when frost did not destroy but preserved, when silence did not stifle but healed. The world forgot that rhythm." But she had turned his gaze toward the cottage window, where Ira sat watching the light on the snow. "She remembers." The midwife frowned slightly. "And what happens now that she's awake?" The stranger's hand tightened upon his staff. "The thaw must finish what the frost began. If she remains here, the balance may falter again. When the last snow melts, she will be called by the rivers, the winds, the places where memory sleeps. She will have to choose whether to stay among men or return to the silence that made her." The words hung in the cold air. The villagers looked to one another, uneasy. "Would she survive without us?" Someone whispered. "She is not meant to live as we do," the stranger said. "But neither is she meant to vanish. Her purpose is to remember both worlds, to keep them from forgetting each other again." The midwife looked down, her heart tightening. "She's only a child," she said softly. The stranger nodded. "For now." He turned his face toward the north, where the pines stretched endlessly into pale mist. "When the river sings a third time," he said, "the choice will come." Then he bowed once more, his cloak catching the light like ice catching fire, and with the same still grace as before, he walked away, leaving only silence behind him. That night, as snow melted from the rooftops and the scent of pine sap filled the air, Ira began to hum in her sleep, the same low melody that once rose from the frozen river, steady, serene, and older than the world. The morning after the stranger's departure was unusually quiet. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though listening for a sound that had not yet returned. Even the children, normally boisterous after a long night's sleep, tiptoed through the snowmelt, watching the pale sunlight glint on the ice-crusted rooftops. The midwife decided it was time for Ira to experience the world beyond the cottage. She wrapped the child in thick wool, placing a soft hood over her hair so white It glimmered like frost under the sun. The villagers watched silently as mother and child stepped into the crisp morning air. They headed toward the edge of the forest, where the pines rose tall and dark against the bright sky. The trees swayed gently, their branches brushing against each other in a soft chorus, almost as though they were welcoming the child. Ira's small hand reached toward the tips of the pines, and for a moment the wind seemed as still, letting her touch the branches without shaking a single needle. As they walked deeper into the woods, the snow beneath their feet became softer, and the hum that had once pulsed from the river now floated faintly through the trees. It was barely audible, yet unmistakable, a melody of ice, of streams running quietly beneath frozen banks, of life held in silent patience. Ira's eyes brightened, and she murmured in her sleep, a gentle echo of the song. The midwife noticed footprints in the snow, tiny, perfect, and not entirely human. They wove between the trees, leading deeper into the woods, fading in and out as though the forest itself were shifting. She followed cautiously, careful not to startle her companion. The air grew colder as they advanced, but it was a soft cold, one that made cheeks tingle and lungs expand with crisp clarity. Small animals, squirrels and birds, watched from the branches, curious but unafraid. Even the distant howl of a wolf seemed gentle, a reminder of the wildness that thrived beneath the snow. Then, at the heart of the forest, they reached a clearing. Frost covered every surface in intricate lace patterns. Sunlight caught on each icy edge, scattering prisms of color across the snow. The hum grew louder here, resonating from the ground itself, and Ira stirred, her tiny fingers tracing shapes in the frozen patterns. The midwife knelt beside her, whispering softly, "Do you hear it, little one? The forest remembers, and it is speaking to you." Ira's pale eyes met hers, bright and clear. For a heartbeat, the clearing seemed to glow from within, the frost spiraling outward like delicate wings. Then the wind sighed, and the trees whispered again, as though sharing secrets of a time long forgotten. The midwife realized then that the child's presence transformed everything: the woods, the snow, even the air seemed alive with her quiet light. She placed Ira back in the cradle she had brought along, and together they sat, listening to the forest's song, breathing in the serene, lingering magic of the winter world. The hum faded slowly, leaving only the whisper of the pines and the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet as they prepared to return to the village. Yet the memory of the clearing and the quiet power it held lingered in both their hearts. That evening, as twilight draped the village in dusky violet, a hush fell over the streets. The air was thick with anticipation, though no one could say why. Windows were shuttered, fires stoked, and lanterns set carefully along paths, as if the villagers themselves sensed something extraordinary was about to unfold. Ira had been unusually restless that day. She crawled from her cradle and wandered toward the window, her pale eyes tracing the first stars appearing above the dark pines. A soft hum vibrated in her chest, the same melody that had once risen from the river and whispered through the forest. It was gentle, low, and almost tangible, filling the room with a quiet warmth that contrasted with the deep cold outside. As night deepened, frost began to bloom along every window pane in the village. Not ordinary frost, but delicate crystalline flowers, each petal shimmering faintly in the lantern light. The villagers stepped outside in awe, their breath forming silver clouds that mingled with the swirling petals of frost. Children reached toward the icy blossoms, their fingers hovering just above the delicate surfaces, without touching. The midwife carried Ira to the main square, cradled close to her chest, With each step, frost spiraled outward from the child, coating the cobblestones in a thin layer of glittering lace. Every lamp, every railing, every snowdrift seemed to bend toward her light, and the villagers felt a profound calm settle into their hearts. From the forest beyond, a soft rustle could be heard, pines bending gently, unseen creatures moving just beyond the reach of lantern glow. The hum from the child grew louder, filling the night with a soothing vibration that seemed to ripple through the very air. Then, as the moon rose high and silvered the square, the frost flowers began to sway as though alive. Turning slowly toward Ira, their petals glimmered, reflecting the child's luminous gaze. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the world entirely captivated by the presence of one small being. The villagers stood in silence, each aware that they were witnessing something sacred. The harshness of the long winter, the fear of famine and darkness, all seemed to melt away in the soft glow of frost and song. Finally, the midwife laid Ira down upon a blanket in the square. The frost flowers curled around her as if to protect her, forming a gentle cradle of ice. The child's humming softened into a whisper, almost inaudible, and the frost itself shimmered with an inner warmth. The night passed slowly, beautifully, and without interruption. By dawn, the frost flowers had melted, leaving only the delicate memory of their intricate shapes. But the villagers knew that something permanent had shifted. A quiet magic had rooted itself in their hearts, carried by a child born beneath the longest night. A week after the night of the frost flowers, the midwife decided to take Ira beyond the familiar paths of the village. She wrapped the child snugly in layers of wool, the edges dusted with snowflakes that clung like tiny diamonds. The villagers watched quietly, offering cautious blessings, for they knew the child's presence had begun to stir forces both wondrous and unknown. The path led toward the old hollow, a valley nestled between two ancient ridges, where the forest thinned and the wind sang more clearly. The hollow was a place of forgotten stories, where snow drifted undisturbed and the trees grew tall but sparse, their branches forming arches overhead like the vaults of a silent cathedral. As they walked, Ira's eyes followed the shapes in the snow, small creatures scuttling under drifted mounds, the glint of ice on rocks catching her gaze. The midwife could feel the hum rising from the ground beneath them, faint at first, like a heartbeat buried deep within the earth. When they reached the hollow, the air itself seemed to shimmer. Snowflakes floated down more slowly here, twisting in impossible patterns, as if dancing to music only they could hear. The midwife knelt to let Ira touch the frost-covered ground. The instant her fingers brushed the snow, it seemed to respond, shifting into delicate arcs, spirals, and tiny frozen blossoms that caught the light in every direction. A hush fell over the hollow. Even the wind softened. The midwife noticed a faint path leading deeper into the valley, where the snow glowed faintly blue under the pale light of the sun hidden behind clouds. She followed cautiously, her breath puffing in gentle clouds, until she found a small depression in the earth, a natural cradle of rock and ice. Ira reached out and pressed her hand against it. The frost responded immediately, spiraling upward into soft columns like miniature towers of light. The hollow seemed to pulse in quiet harmony with the child, as though the very land recognized her as part of its memory. The midwife sat beside Ira, feeling the weight of time in that place, centuries of snow, of silence, of life waiting beneath ice. She whispered softly, "The world remembers you, little one, and so it bends to your presence." Ira hummed, the vibration spreading through the hollow and carrying with it the scent of pine, the faint tang of ice, and the soft warmth of renewal. The midwife closed her eyes, letting herself be carried by the serenity. Here, in the old hollow, the child's connection to the world felt absolute, a gentle reminder of both the fragility and strength of life under winter's embrace. The sun dipped lower, and the midwife knew it was time to return. Yet even as they walked back toward the village, the hollow seemed to linger, a quiet echo in the snow, a memory of frost and light, waiting for its moment to bloom again. Though the days had grown longer and the sunlight warmer, winter was not finished with the village. A soft, grey hush descended from the north one morning, and the villagers awoke to find snow falling again, not the delicate frost of before, but thick, whispering flakes that drifted lazily yet endlessly, blanketing rooftops, streets, and fields in quiet white. Ira, now able to sit upright in her small cradle, pressed her tiny hands against the window pane. Her eyes, pale and luminous, followed each snowflake as it spun gracefully toward the earth. A low hum rose from her chest, almost inaudible, and the snow outside seemed to respond. Drifts shaped themselves into subtle patterns, curling around fences and doorways in arcs that glimmered faintly in the dim morning light. The villagers moved cautiously through the storm, their breath hung in clouds, their boots sinking into the soft snow, but none dared to complain. There was a strange serenity to this snowfall, a calm that contrasted with the wild winds of winter past. Even the animals seemed to sense it. The village dogs lay curled beside hearths, and birds perched quietly on frost-laden branches. The midwife wrapped Ira in a heavier woolen blanket and carried her to the center of the village, where the snow lay deepest. She set the child down gently upon a small sled made of pine, and the villagers gathered around, their eyes wide with wonder. As Ira's tiny fingers brushed the snow, delicate frost spirals rose from the ground, forming intricate shapes like frozen petals and lacy vines. The hum grew louder, harmonizing with the wind as it whispered through the pines. Even the blacksmith, who had always been practical and grounded, paused in awe. "It's as though the snow itself listens to her," he murmured. For hours Ira sat there, her gaze following the patterns forming around her. The villagers began to move slowly, almost reverently, through the snowy maze, careful not to disturb the fragile creations that glimmered beneath her influence. A quiet joy filled the air, a peace born from the knowledge that even in the harshest winter, life and light persisted. By evening, the snowstorm had begun to wane. The flakes thinned, the wind softened, and the village emerged into a calm world, bathed in soft silver light. Though the storm had left a fresh layer of snow in its wake, there was no fear, no tension, only the serene aftermath of a world reminded of its own quiet magic. Ira, now drowsy, was carried back to the midwife's cottage. She hummed softly in her sleep, a lullaby that seemed to echo through the village, lingering in windows and rooftops, carrying the promise of renewal long after the storm had passed. A fortnight later, the midwife decided it was time to visit the river once more. Ira had grown curious about its gentle murmurs, the soft reflections of sky upon ice, and the way the water seemed to move beneath the surface even when the cold held it firm. Wrapped in layers of wool, she sat in the midwife's arms as they walked through the village, leaving soft tracks in the newly fallen snow. The river glimmered under the pale sunlight, its surface fractured into slender ribbons of ice, through which dark water moved like liquid glass. Frost flowers, remnants of Ira's influence, still clung to the edges, catching light and bending it into delicate prisms. The hum that seemed to live in the child's chest grew faintly, a low vibration echoing that of the flowing water. The midwife knelt beside her, setting Ira gently on a drifted bank. "Do you hear it?" she asked. The river has a story to tell. Ira's eyes widened, pale and reflective as the water beneath her. Tiny fingers reached toward the ice, and where she touched, frost spiraled outward in delicate patterns, arcs, swirls, and miniature channels that seemed to guide the water below. Slowly, the ice began to shimmer and part, revealing a narrow stream that glowed faintly blue, as though lit from the depths. The midwife gasped. The river had not moved like this since the long winter had begun. It seemed to recognize the child, bending itself around her presence, revealing secrets hidden beneath frozen layers for months. Small fish darted beneath the clear water, their scales reflecting a light that mirrored Ira's own. A soft wind rose through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and thawing earth. The river's song grew stronger, a melody of memory and patience, echoing through the forest. Ira hummed along with it, her tiny voice blending with the music of water, ice, and wind. The frost patterns expanded, forming intricate bridges over the flowing stream, delicate enough to vanish if touched too quickly, but persistent enough to leave beauty in their wake. The midwife watched awed, as the village itself seemed to hold its breath. The story of the river, of its hidden paths, and the life it carried beneath the ice, unfolded quietly before them, revealed by the child who was born beneath the longest night. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft rose and silver, the midwife lifted Ira once more. The river's secret remained, a memory etched in frost and light, and the hum of the child's lullaby carried them gently back toward home. The morning after the river's revelation, the village felt lighter, as if a deep weight had lifted during the night. Sunlight reflected off the snow in brilliant bursts, glinting on frost-dusted rooftops and icicles that hung like delicate glass daggers. For the first time in many weeks, the villagers spoke freely, their voices carrying a sense of quiet awe rather than fear. Ira sat in her cradle by the window, watching the sun play across the snow. Her pale hair caught the light, glowing faintly like frost in the dawn. The low hum in her chest pulsed gently, a soothing rhythm that seemed to echo throughout the cottage and into the village beyond. Outside, children ran through the streets, their laughter weaving through the crisp morning air. Dogs bounded alongside them, leaving fleeting paw prints in the fresh snow. Even the adults moved with more ease, carrying out their tasks with a calm attentiveness, as though each step had a purpose and the world had remembered how to breathe. The midwife stepped out into the square, holding Ira close. She could feel the faintest warmth emanating from the child, soft as sunlight on frozen ground. Villagers gathered slowly, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a sense of connection, the same quiet awareness that had guided them through the longest night and the frost flowers and the river's secret. It's as if she carries the season itself. The baker whispered to his wife, watching Ira's tiny hand reach toward the falling snow. Each flake that touched her seemed to linger in the air longer than natural, spiraling in delicate patterns before settling on the ground. The blacksmith nodded, his eyes wide with wonder. "Not the cold," he said, "not the hardship, but the beauty, the quiet strength in the snow and ice." As the villagers moved about, performing their daily tasks with a newfound rhythm, the wind stirred in the trees, the pines whispered faintly, and the snow shimmered with patterns that shifted subtly in the sunlight. It was as though the village itself had been awakened by the child, by the gentle pulse of frost and life intertwined. Ira hummed softly, her eyes following a single crow perched atop a distant roof. The melody seemed to ripple outward, touching every person, animal, and snowflake with a delicate resonance. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the village was fully alive again, hearts light, spirits lifted, and a sense of hope restored after months of frozen despair. That night, the midwife tucked Ira into her cradle, and the soft hum continued, a lullaby for the village itself. The snow fell gently once more, but this time without urgency, without harshness. Every flake seemed to carry a promise that even in the longest night, light and life would endure. A few days later, the midwife decided to take Ira to the frozen meadow, a wide expanse beyond the village, where the snow stretched uninterrupted, and the wind carved patterns into the drifts like slow, deliberate brushstrokes. The villagers had long avoided the meadow in winter. Its flat openness made it feel vulnerable, exposed to the relentless cold and the eerie hush of the wilderness. Yet with Ira in her arms, the midwife felt no fear, only curiosity. The child's pale eyes followed every movement as they walked. The snow beneath their boots sparkled in tiny fragments, catching the dim sunlight like stars scattered across the ground. The hum from Ira's chest had grown faintly stronger in recent days, and it seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the wind as they approached the meadow. Here, the frost took on shapes even more delicate than in the village: fractal spirals, crystalline arches, and intricate lattice that shimmered as though alive. As Ira's tiny hands brushed the snow, the frost responded immediately, rising and curling in miniature towers and petals. The midwife knelt to observe, mesmerized by the gentle interplay of child and ice. Suddenly, movement stirred in the far corner of the meadow. A herd of deer emerged from the tree line, their coats dusted with frost, their breaths rising in gentle clouds. They stopped at the edge of Ira's influence, tilting their heads as if aware of her presence. The child's eyes followed them, unblinking, and a soft, melodic hum rose from her lips, so faint it could barely be heard above the whispering wind. The frost patterns on the ground shifted with each note, forming delicate pathways and bridges that connected one shimmering mound to another. The deer stepped carefully along these natural guides, moving in silent grace, as if walking a frozen cathedral crafted by the child herself. The midwife watched, awed by the harmony unfolding before her. Even the sun seemed to pause, casting long, soft shadows across the glittering expanse. She realized, with a gentle awe, that Ira did not merely exist in the world. She shaped it, bending it toward quiet beauty and calm. As the afternoon waned and the light softened into the pink and gold of evening, the midwife lifted Ira once more. The frost meadows seemed to sigh in response, the intricate ice forms slowly collapsing back into soft, glittering snow. The deer lingered at the edge of the tree line for a moment longer before disappearing into the woods, leaving only their delicate tracks behind. When they returned to the village, the midwife felt a sense of calm settle over her. The world had expanded today, if only for a few hours, and she carried the memory of it in her heart, a reminder that even the most frozen landscapes could blossom with quiet magic in the presence of the frost child. One evening, as twilight bled into the village and long shadows stretched across the snow, the midwife sensed a subtle change in the air. The warmth of the day had vanished quickly, leaving a crisp, biting chill that pricked her cheeks and fingers. Yet it was not the cold alone that caused her unease. There was a whisper in the wind, faint and deliberate, threading through the pines and curling around the rooftops. Ira sat in her cradle, pale eyes wide and unafraid, following the movement of the shadows beyond the window. A low hum began in her chest, gentle but insistent, vibrating in tune with the rhythm of the whisper outside. The midwife watched her, heart tightening slightly, sensing that the child was aware of something the villagers could not see. Outside, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, weaving along fences, snowdrifts, and trees. They moved with a silent grace, curling and twisting as if alive. Small animals stirred uneasily in the underbrush, their calls muted and anxious. Even the river seemed to slow its murmur, its water flowing more solemnly beneath the thin ice. The midwife wrapped Ira tightly in wool and stepped outside, her breath forming silver clouds. The child's hand rested lightly on her chest, and the hum grew stronger, vibrating through the ground beneath them. Where her fingers brushed the air, frost glimmered faintly, tracing gentle patterns over the snow, as if to guard against the approaching darkness. From the forest edge, the whisper intensified, a low, almost melodic hiss. The midwife realized it was not wind alone. The sound carried intention, subtle and old, like a story that had been waiting centuries to be told. Ira's gaze followed the movement, calm but discerning, and with a small, soft gesture, she reached out. The shadows hesitated, curling back slightly at her presence. The villagers peeked from windows and doorways, silent and tense. The midwife spoke gently to the child. "Do you see them, little one? They are curious, but we are here together." Ira hummed, and the frost shifted in response, forming a delicate, glowing barrier that seemed to shimmer between the village and the forest. Hours passed in quiet watchfulness. The shadows moved closer and then receded, as if testing the child's influence. Yet at no point did they press forward aggressively. They paused, whispered, and then melted back into the night, leaving the village bathed in pale moonlight. By dawn, the chill had softened and the whisper of shadows was gone. The frost patterns remained, delicate and intricate, a testament to the child's quiet power. The villagers, though hesitant to speak, understood something vital. Ira was not merely a child of snow and light. She was a bridge between worlds, between warmth and cold, seen and unseen, silence and song. The midwife carried her back inside, heart full of awe and a lingering sense of vigilance. The frost child slept once more, her hum fading to a gentle whisper, as if sharing the memory of the night with the world itself. Days passed slowly after the encounter with the whispering shadows, and the village settled into a quiet rhythm once more. Yet the air carried a subtle shift, a promise of life returning even as frost still gripped the ground. Ira seemed to sense it before anyone else. Her pale eyes followed the tiny movements of buds beneath snowdrifts, the first hints of green peeking through, and a low hum resonated from her chest, gentle but insistent. The midwife took her to a small garden at the edge of the village, a plot where herbs and winter crops had survived the harsh months. The soil, though hard with frost, was beginning to soften under the sun's weak warmth. Ira's tiny fingers brushed the frozen earth, and where she touched, frost lifted, spirals forming in the soil like miniature bridges. Within those arcs, tiny shoots of green had begun to rise, the first blooms of winter reaching toward the light. The villagers gathered quietly, drawn by the miracle unfolding before them. Old women wept softly at the sight of life returning, and children reached down to touch the tender sprouts, leaving their prints in the soft snow nearby. Even the blacksmith paused mid-work, his hammer suspended in the air, marveling at the fragile green threads twisting upward from the frozen ground. The midwife whispered to Ira, "See what you bring, little one. Even in the deepest cold, life remembers how to bloom." The child hummed, and the sound seemed to carry warmth into the garden. The frost flowers that had persisted along the edges of the village softened into glittering dew, shimmering and melting into the soil as the sprouts pushed upward. From the surrounding woods, a soft breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of pine and thawing earth. Small birds, previously absent during the harshest months, returned cautiously, hopping along branches and pecking at seeds now uncovered by the child's quiet magic. Each movement of the natural world seemed attuned to Ira's presence, responding as if she were the rhythm of the season itself. By evening, the village garden had transformed. Where only frost and silence had existed, there were now fragile petals of green, tiny blossoms pushing through the soil, shimmering in the last light of the day. The villagers whispered among themselves, speaking of hope renewed, of the impossible made gentle and real by the child who had been born beneath the longest night. The midwife carried Ira back to the cottage, smiling softly. The hum in the child's chest had quieted to a soothing murmur, the promise of spring lingering in her touch, and the soft glow of frost that clung gently to her hair. That night, the village slept under a canopy of stars, the world feeling lighter, renewed, and tenderly alive. A few nights later, the midwife noticed a peculiar glow drifting across the village as darkness fell. Lanterns in every window flickered brighter than usual, their flames steady against the chill night air. Snowflakes glinted with faint colors, and the soft hum from Ira's chest seemed to pulse in time with the light. Curious, she carried Ira to the village square. The child, wrapped in thick wool, sat quietly in her arms, her pale eyes reflecting the lantern's brilliance. Around them, frost began to rise from the snow in delicate spires, curling upward like the glowing tendrils of miniature towers. Each spiral caught the lantern light and refracted it, scattering tiny rainbows across the village streets. The villagers gathered slowly, their breath hanging in clouds. No one had seen anything quite like it. The frost towers seemed alive, gentle and quiet, yet undeniably purposeful, rising taller as the hum from Ira grew louder. Children reached out, and the frost responded, bending softly around their fingers without breaking. The midwife knelt in the center of the square, whispering to the child, "Do you see? Even the light bends for you." Ira's small hand extended toward a cluster of spiraling frost, and the towers responded immediately, twisting and swaying as though dancing to a melody only she could hear. The lantern's glow shimmered brighter with every motion, reflecting across the snow in a kaleidoscope of color. From the edges of the village, the wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and thawing snow. The snowflakes sparkled in its movement, tiny prisms spinning slowly toward the ground. Even the river, visible through the gaps between buildings, shimmered with a faint inner light, as if the water itself had joined in the display. Hours passed, and the villagers remained silent, captivated by the beauty that unfolded. The frost towers gradually receded, curling gently back into the snow, as the hum in Ira's chest softened to a gentle murmur. By the time the moon hung high, the village lay bathed in a serene glow, the memory of light and frost lingering like a dream. That night, as the midwife carried Ira back to her cradle, the child hummed softly in her sleep, a lullaby of frost and lanterns. The village slept beneath the stars, hearts quiet and minds calm, wrapped in the gentle magic of the frost child who had brought wonder even to the darkest nights. A week later, the midwife felt a pull toward the river once more. The thaw had continued slowly, but beneath the fractured ice, something stirred, something that seemed to respond only to Ira. She wrapped the child warmly and carried her through the village streets, where frost glimmered faintly in the early morning light, as if each step had left a trail of quiet magic. At the riverbank, the ice was thin in places, and small currents whispered beneath the surface. Ira leaned forward in the midwife's arms, her eyes fixed on the dark water below. A low hum rose in her chest, steady and soft, and for a moment the midwife felt the world itself quiet to listen. Where Ira's tiny fingers hovered above the ice, The frozen surface shimmered, not breaking, but revealing glimpses of the hidden world beneath, dark shapes moving slowly through the currents, glints of scales, and the gentle sway of plants anchored to the riverbed. The midwife held her breath, realizing that the child was not merely observing, she was communicating, her presence coaxing the river's secrets into view. The wind shifted in the trees, carrying the scent of cold water, pine, and wet earth. The ice responded, faint patterns spiraling across its surface, arcs and bridges that seemed to shimmer with inner light. Tiny fish swam beneath these delicate formations, their movement echoing the gentle rhythm of Ira's hum. From the far side of the river, a soft ripple stirred. The midwife thought she saw shapes, long, slender, glimmering forms moving toward the center of the river. They did not leap or splash. They glided silently, as though aware of the child and the power she wielded simply by being present. Ira's hum deepened, resonating through the air, the snow, and even the ice beneath her fingers. It was a lullaby, a song older than the river itself, calling forth life that had been hidden beneath the frozen layers. The midwife watched in awe as frost patterns rose around the edges of the ice, delicate columns curling skyward, casting tiny rainbows in the morning sun. For hours they remained at the riverbank, silent and reverent. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the hidden world beneath the ice had revealed itself in fragments, then slowly receded, leaving only the quiet murmur of flowing water and the faint shimmer of frost. The midwife carried Ira home with a sense of wonder, understanding more clearly than ever that the child was a bridge, a presence that connected the surface and the hidden depths, the seen and the unseen. That night, Ira hummed softly in her cradle, her lullaby echoing in dreams of river currents and frostlit worlds beneath the ice. One night, under a sky heavy with silver clouds and a pale, watching moon, the midwife carried Ira into the forest. The trees cast long, dark shadows across the snow, and every breath of wind seemed to hum softly through the pines. It was a night of quiet anticipation, as if the world itself were holding its breath. They arrived at a small clearing, a hidden place where snow lay untouched, glistening like powdered glass. The midwife laid Ira down gently on a blanket of soft moss beneath the frost-dusted trees. The child's pale eyes immediately followed the arcs of moonlight filtering through the branches, and a low hum rose in her chest, delicate, almost like the echo of water against ice. Frost began to spiral upward from the snow, delicate columns catching the moonlight and scattering faint prisms across the clearing. Each breath of Ira's hum guided the patterns, turning them into shapes resembling flowers, stars, and soft wings unfurling in the night. The midwife sat nearby, watching in silence as the child's quiet influence transformed the small clearing into a luminous wonder. From the edge of the trees, small animals emerged, rabbits, foxes, and the occasional deer, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the gentle power emanating from the child. They moved slowly, reverently, pausing in the moonlight to observe the frost blooms that seemed to respond to each subtle movement of Ira's hands. The wind whispered through the treetops, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and winter flowers beginning to stir beneath the snow. Each note of the hum resonated with the forest itself, creating a harmony that felt older than memory, serene and grounding. Even the shadows cast by the moon seemed gentler here, stretching like soft silk across the snow, and the midwife realized the clearing had become a sanctuary, a place where winter and life could coexist in quiet balance. Hours passed slowly, each moment dripping with calm. By the time the first hints of dawn tinged the sky in soft pink and silver, the frost began to recede into delicate shards of sparkling snow. Ira, drowsy and content, hummed one last gentle note before drifting into sleep. The midwife gathered her in her arms, carrying her back to the village, the memory of the moonlit clearing lingering like a soft blessing. She understood now more clearly than ever that the child's presence was not just magical, it was a quiet force of balance, capable of turning stillness into life and darkness into serene light. In the days that followed the moonlit clearing, a gentle change settled over the village. The frost still clung to rooftops and windows, but it no longer carried the sharp bite of midwinter. Instead, it shimmered softly, bending in delicate arcs that reflected the rising sun. It was as if the world were breathing slowly, easing itself from the long, frozen hold of winter. Ira, nestled in her cradle by the window, watched the morning light spill across the village streets. The low hum in her chest began softly, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to reach outward, touching the snow, the trees, and the edges of every roof. Where her small hand brushed the window pane, frost patterns shimmered and shifted, curling into shapes reminiscent of waves, petals, and gentle spirals. The villagers noticed the change too. Children played in the streets, their laughter weaving through the crisp air, and even the adults moved with a quiet grace, performing daily tasks as though the world itself had slowed to a rhythm that matched the child's hum. The blacksmith paused mid-strike, feeling the warmth in the air deepen and the frost on his anvil glimmer with faint light. The midwife carried Ira toward the edge of the village, where the forest began to thin. Here, the frost on the ground was thinner, the snow softer, and the scent of pine mixed with thawing earth. Ira leaned forward, her tiny fingers brushing the air above the snow. Wherever she reached, frost spiraled gently, forming small arches and bridges that seemed to guide the flow of the wind itself. The hum grew slightly stronger, resonating through the frozen trees and the soft, melting snow. Birds returned, hopping along branches and dipping into hidden patches of thawed earth. Even the river, flowing quietly beneath its fragile ice, seemed to pulse in harmony with the child's presence. The midwife watched in awe, feeling the gentle rhythm of winter itself, a breath that inhaled the chill of ice and exhaled the promise of life. By evening, the sun had dipped low, painting the village and forest in hues of rose and gold. Ira, now drowsy, hummed one last soft note before drifting to sleep. The frost shimmered faintly around her, curling back into the snow like a whisper of winter's breath. The midwife carried her home, understanding more fully than ever that the frost child's gift was not simply control over cold or frost, but the ability to awaken the world gently, to harmonize life and stillness, and to remind all who lived in her presence that even the harshest winter could breathe softly and yield to renewal. One evening, as the sun sank behind distant ridges, the midwife felt the unmistakable pull of something extraordinary. Wrapped in layers of wool, Ira was unusually alert, her pale eyes reflecting the fading light like polished ice. The low hum in her chest, usually soft and soothing, now resonated with a deeper intensity, a vibration that seemed to ripple through the very air around them. The midwife carried her to the edge of the forest, where the snow glimmered in long silver streaks. Shadows stretched and shifted with the last rays of sunlight, and the trees seemed to lean closer, whispering among themselves, as if aware that something rare was about to occur. As they reached a small clearing, Ira stirred and lifted her hands. Where her fingers hovered, frost blossomed into intricate shapes that rose from the snow like delicate wings. The formations shimmered with a soft luminescence, bending light in gentle arcs that scattered tiny fragments across the frozen ground. From the depths of the forest, small creatures emerged, foxes, rabbits, and birds, all moving cautiously toward the clearing. They paused at the edge, captivated by the shimmering frost wings that now arched gracefully above the child. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, flowing around the shapes in soft, swirling currents. Ira hummed, a melody that carried with it the serene calm of ice, the softness of newly fallen snow, and the quiet power of life beneath frost. The frost wings responded immediately, twisting and turning as if dancing to her song, expanding outward until the entire clearing glowed faintly silver. The midwife knelt nearby, her heart caught in awe. The child's presence was no longer just gentle magic. It had become a living tapestry of light and frost, harmonizing the frozen world into patterns of breathtaking beauty. Every snowflake, every shadow, every breath of wind seemed to follow the rhythm of Ira's hum. Hours passed in silence, the world outside the clearing still and reverent. By the time the moon rose high, the frost wings slowly softened, curling back into the snow and leaving behind a delicate shimmer, as though the memory of their flight lingered in the air itself. The midwife lifted Ira, now drowsy, in her arms. The child hummed one last, soft note before drifting into sleep. The clearing remained quiet, luminous, and serene, a gentle reminder that even in the deepest winter, light, beauty, and calm could unfurl like wings in the night. The days grew longer now, the sun lingering in the sky, warming the snow just enough to make it sparkle like tiny crystals in motion. The village felt lighter, as though the world itself exhaled after months of frozen silence. Ira, now more aware of her surroundings, seemed attuned to the subtle shifts in the air, her pale eyes reflecting the soft glow of morning. The midwife carried her to the outskirts of the village, where the first hints of green peeked through thawing snow. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine, and tiny streams whispered beneath thin sheets of ice. Ira's low hum rose steadily, a gentle vibration that harmonized with the awakening forest. Where she reached, frost spiraled delicately, not as rigid as winter ice, but as soft as lace, curling around, sprouting shoots and buds. Each swirl seemed to nudge life forward, coaxing fragile green leaves through the snow. The villagers followed cautiously, marveling at how the child's presence transformed the landscape, turning thawing winter into the first delicate whispers of spring. Birds returned in small flocks, their songs mingling with the hum emanating from Ira. Rabbits hopped along the edges of thawed patches, and even the river seemed to sing, its water flowing more freely, reflecting the sky in gleaming silver arcs. The midwife watched, captivated, as the child's quiet influence harmonized the world, snow, earth, water, and life all moving together in a soft, deliberate rhythm. By mid-afternoon, the forest edges were alive with subtle color, tender green shoots, frost patterns curling around newly exposed soil, and sunlight catching dew upon each blade of grass. The villagers knelt or crouched, marveling at the gentle miracle unfolding before them. For many, it was the first true sign of hope after the relentless cold, a promise that life could endure and even flourish under the guidance of the frost child. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in rose and gold, the midwife carried Ira back to the village. The child hummed softly in her sleep, the melody a tender lullaby, not just for herself, but for the world she touched. That night, the village slept peacefully under a sky slowly shedding winter's shadow, hearts lightened by the first song of spring carried by the one born beneath the longest night. With spring's first whispers growing stronger each day, the midwife decided to take Ira to the village garden, a small patch of earth that had survived the harshest months under a blanket of snow. The soil was damp and soft now, releasing the rich scent of life reawakening. Ira's pale eyes widened as she watched tender shoots push through the thawing ground, and a low hum rose from her chest, vibrating with quiet energy. As she reached toward the plants, frost appeared delicate, silvery spirals that did not chill or bite, but seemed to nurture the young shoots, guiding them upward. Each swirl of frost glimmered in the sunlight, reflecting in tiny prisms across petals, leaves, and soft soil. The child's presence transformed the garden into a sanctuary of calm and wonder, where the fragile balance of thaw and bloom harmonized perfectly. The villagers followed quietly, sensing that this garden was more than mere soil and seed. Children bent close to inspect the tiny blossoms, their fingers brushing the frost gently without disturbing it. Birds perched on nearby branches, chirping softly as if accompanying the child's hum in a delicate chorus. Even the bees, early risers from their winter slumber, hovered above the fragile buds, drawn to the warmth and calm in the air. The midwife knelt beside Ira, whispering, "Do you see, little one? You awaken the world gently, without haste or fear." The child's hands moved slowly across the garden, and each movement prompted new growth, tiny shoots stretching higher, frost curling into protective shapes around buds, and soft green vines intertwining with delicate arcs of ice. Time seemed suspended in the garden. Even the sun lingered, bathing the scene in soft gold. The village watched, spellbound by the quiet power of Ira's presence, feeling the subtle pulse of life returning not just to the garden, but to every corner of their world. By evening, the frost had melted into gentle dew, leaving behind a garden that seemed to breathe with new life. Ira, now drowsy, hummed softly in her sleep as the midwife carried her home, the memory of the Garden of Light lingering in the villagers' hearts. They knew that the child was no ordinary being. She was a quiet force of renewal, a gentle bridge between winter and spring, and a reminder that even the longest night could give birth to life and hope. Several days later, the midwife felt an irresistible pull toward a part of the forest the villagers seldom visited, a hidden glade nestled between ancient pines and moss-covered rocks. It was a place untouched by the paths of humans, where snow lay deep and quiet, and the wind whispered in secret tones. She wrapped Ira carefully and carried her through the soft, crunching snow, the child's pale eyes observing every subtle shift in light and shadow. As they stepped into the glade, Ira stirred, her hum rising gently, vibrating through the frozen branches and snow-laden ground. Frost began to spiral delicately from the snow, forming arcs and bridges that shimmered faintly in the soft sunlight filtering through the trees. Tiny animals peeked from behind tree trunks, a hare, a fox, and several birds, drawn by the warmth and calm emanating from the child. In the very center of the glade, a small pond, still partially frozen, reflected the light in glimmering silver. Ira reached toward it, and the ice shimmered and rippled without breaking. As though aware of her touch, frost spirals formed over the surface, delicate as lace, and a soft melody echoed from her hum, harmonizing with the subtle murmur of water beneath. The midwife knelt beside her, sensing that the glade held memories older than the village itself, secrets of winter and life intertwined. As Ira's tiny hands moved slowly across the snow, frost arcs extended outward, curling around fallen branches and rocks, creating miniature sanctuaries for the woodland creatures. The glade seemed to pulse with quiet life, a delicate rhythm of ice, water, and breath that flowed directly from the child. Hours passed in stillness and gentle wonder. The wind whispered softly through the pines, the snow shimmered under the shifting light, and Ira hummed a lullaby only the glade could hear. By late afternoon, the frost had receded slightly, leaving behind soft sparkling patterns that hinted at the magic that had bloomed there. The midwife lifted Ira, feeling the weight of awe and serenity settle in her heart. The child had transformed the hidden glade into a place of luminous calm, a sanctuary of frost and light that would remain in memory even as the world continued its slow march toward spring. The path back to the village felt lighter, as if every step carried the gentle pulse of the glade itself. As the days lengthened, the midwife felt compelled to guide Irahaya into the hills beyond the village. Snow still clung to every surface, but the sun's warmth had begun to soften its edges, making the world shimmer with fragile light. Wrapped snugly in thick wool, Ira's pale eyes scanned the landscape, following the delicate arcs of frost sparkling in the morning sun. They reached a ridge overlooking the forest, where the tall pines arched above like a natural cathedral. Each branch was tipped with frost that glimmered in the soft light, creating a canopy that seemed both solid and fragile, a delicate lattice suspended between earth and sky. Ira's hum rose in her chest, gentle and resonant, as if communicating with the frozen treetops above. The frost on the branches responded immediately, twisting into patterns that looked like wings, stars, and spirals, stretching from bough to bough like a quiet celebration of the season. The midwife watched as the canopy seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Ira's song, the light filtering through in delicate prisms that danced across the snow-covered ground. Birds and small creatures emerged cautiously, drawn to the warmth and calm radiating from the child. Even the wind slowed, curling through the treetops in gentle arcs rather than gusts, carrying the faint scent of pine and thawing earth. The forest seemed alive, not in the harshness of survival, but in the quiet, patient beauty of winter easing toward spring. Ira reached her tiny hand toward one of the frost-covered branches, and the lattice above shimmered in response. Snowflakes lifted slightly, drifting in slow spirals, catching sunlight and scattering tiny rainbows across the forest floor. The midwife knelt beside her, feeling the profound harmony between the child, the frost, and the living forest. Hours passed in silence and awe. When the sun began its descent, the frost slowly softened, curling delicately back into the branches and snow, leaving behind a memory of fragile beauty. Ira, drowsy, hummed one last note before drifting into sleep in the midwife's arms. The frosted canopy remained imprinted in the heart, a luminous, serene testament to the quiet power of the child born beneath the longest night. With spring steadily unfolding, the midwife felt the urge to return once more to the river, now freer of ice, its waters whispering over smooth stones and winding gently through thawed banks. Ira, wrapped snugly in layers of wool, sat quietly in her arms, her pale eyes reflecting the soft sunlight that danced on the flowing water. A low hum rose from her chest, delicate yet insistent, harmonizing with the gentle murmur of the river itself. As they approached the edge, frost spirals emerged along the banks where her fingers brushed the snow, curling into delicate arches that seemed to float above the water. Tiny reflections of light shimmered across the rippling surface, creating the appearance of a river lined with liquid stars. Ira's humming grew stronger, resonating through the air, the water, and even the soft earth beneath their feet. Small creatures appeared at the river's edge, otters, birds, and deer, drawn by the quiet, luminous magic emanating from the child. They moved slowly and reverently, stepping along the frozen spirals and gentle frost arcs that guided them safely across the thin patches of ice and snow. Each movement seemed in perfect harmony with the hum, the flowing water, and the sunlight filtering through the trees. The midwife knelt nearby, watching in awe as the rivers seemed to transform under Ira's gentle influence. Where frost touched the water, it caught the light and formed glowing bridges, delicate enough to vanish if disturbed, yet persistent as if carrying the memory of each moment. Ira's hum intertwined with the rhythm of the river, creating a quiet symphony of water, light, frost, and life, a lullaby for the world itself. Hours passed in serene stillness. The river, though flowing steadily, seemed suspended in time, aware of the delicate magic weaving above it. By late afternoon, the frost gradually softened into dew, the glowing bridges dissolving, leaving only the tranquil reflective surface of the river sparkling under the sun. The midwife carried Ira back toward the village, the memory of the river of light lingering in her mind like a soft, luminous dream. Even as night fell and the village settled into calm, the child hummed gently in her cradle, echoing the song of water, frost, and life, a quiet reminder of the magic she carried and the world she touched. At last, the midwife carried Ira to the hill overlooking the village, the place where she had first been born beneath the longest night. The sky was a deep indigo, pierced by countless stars, and a faint crescent moon cast silver light across the snow-dusted rooftops. The air was still calm and full of quiet anticipation, as if the world itself knew that tonight would be different, a night of remembrance and gentle closure. Ira, wrapped in soft layers, sat quietly in the midwife's arms. Her pale eyes reflected the starlight, wide and luminous, and the low hum in her chest pulsed with a serene rhythm that seemed to echo through the entire landscape. Frost formed delicate patterns across the snow where her tiny fingers hovered, curling into arcs, spirals, and miniature towers that shimmered in the moonlight. The village below lay peaceful. Chimneys rose thin ribbons of smoke, lanterns glimmered faintly in windows, and soft whispers of life moved through the streets. Animals, too, paused in the hush, foxes curling beside barns, birds perched silently on frost-coated branches. All bore witness, in quiet awe, to the culmination of a long season, the longest night transformed by the presence of a child born to light and frost. Ira's hum deepened, resonating like a gentle lullaby through snow, trees, and stone. Frost arcs rose higher, linking with branches, rooftops, and even the tips of distant hills. Light reflected from each crystal curve, scattering soft rainbows into the night. The midwife knelt beside her, whispering, "See what you have given the world, little one." Even the coldest, darkest night can be full of life and wonder. The hum softened as Ira's eyes drooped, and she fell asleep in the midwife's arms. The frost slowly dissolved into sparkling dew, leaving the hill bathed in serene silver light. The village slept beneath a sky of stars, hearts calm, and spirits lifted by the quiet magic that had threaded through the winter and into spring. The midwife smiled, feeling the weight of gratitude and awe settle upon her. Ira, the frost child, had taught the village and the world that even in the longest night, light, life, and hope could bloom. The story ends here, softly and gently. May your own mind drift in the same peace the frost child brought to the world. Let the calm settle around you like snow, and allow rest to come as quietly and surely as the first frost. Thank you for joining this journey. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment to share your thoughts wherever you are in the US, Europe, or beyond, no matter what time it is. Close your eyes, Breathe deeply and let the longest night carry you into the sweetest, most peaceful sleep.